Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography. Written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-ming.
Chapter 15: Peking University and the Student Revolt. If you throw a stone into a body of still water, rings of waves begin to rise and travel farther and farther, ever widening and extending away from the center. In Peking, capital of China during 5 dynasties and more than 10 centuries, the seat of conservatism, where the Empress Dowager ruled the country from her dragon throne, stood the oldest modern institution of learning in the country, known as the National University of Peking. It was the only landmark left by Emperor Guangxu's short-lived reforms of 1898. The brief tide of reform had ebbed and vanished into history. Only a few scattered shells remained, witness to the vicissitudes of fortune in that placid ancient capital. But the university, in which were clustered the living shells that contained pearls, was destined to make valuable contributions to culture and thought within the short span of 1 generation. The man who threw the stone of intellectual revolt into that placid water was Dr. Cai Yuanpei, who, in 1916, became Chancellor of the university. Dr. Cai was an eminent scholar of China's ancient culture, but imbued with the spirit of Western scholarship and especially the spirit of free inquiry which prevailed in the Hellenic world. His belief in knowledge for knowledge's sake, in contrast to the learning for its practical use of Chinese thought, had its foundation in the thorough knowledge of ancient Greek culture. His views on knowledge were essentially the same as those of Dr. Sun, but the latter had acquired his outlook from the natural sciences, Dr. Cai his from a study of Greek philosophy. This renowned scholar preferred the appreciation of beauty to belief in religion. Here we find an interesting blending of Greek and Chinese culture. The traditional love of nature of the Chinese scholar and the Greek sense of beauty working together in Dr. Cai's mind resulted in a love for Western sculpture and the Chinese carvings, Chinese landscape painting and Western portraits, both Chinese and Western architecture, and Chinese and Western music. His views on religion were essentially Chinese. Religion is but part of morality. He wanted to elevate the moral sense of youth to a higher level by love of beauty. It was an ancient Chinese belief that there is no greater moral force than that of music. Good morals had their foundation in well-balanced emotions, which could only be brought about by the fine arts and music or poetry, which is closely allied to music. Dr. Cai had great faith in natural science. He not only trusted it to yield inventions, engineering, and other benefits, but believed it would foster the mental habits of methodical thinking and research, which led to the discovery of general truths, the foundation of all true knowledge. In his younger days, his brilliance was less veiled in modesty. When he was principal of the Sino-Occidental school at Shaoxing, which I attended in my boyhood, one evening at a banquet, after a few cups of Shaoxing wine, he stood up and announced at the top of his voice that the reforms of Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao were too superficial, since they retained the Qing court to lead them. I, Cai Yuanpei, will not do that. Unless you overthrow the Qing dynasty, no reforms will be possible. He shouted it out, raising his right arm over his head. Dr. Cai in his early years wrote essays full of brilliant and stimulating ideas contrary to the common practice of writing in the days of civil examinations. My uncle King told me of a strange essay of his which began, "In sex, food, and drinking, human desires lie." He handed in his paper to the imperial examiners after the time limit. The night was getting on to the small hours, and the eyes of the examiners were heavy with sleep. His paper was accepted, and he passed the examination for the second degree, 举人, or the promoted scholar. In the following years, he achieved the third or highest degree, 进士, or advanced scholar, when still under 30. He subsequently entered Hanlin Academy, composed of the highest-ranking scholars, which has since ceased to exist. In his later years, he was the personification of what is best in the Chinese scholar, with a broad mind open to Western ideas. His eyes, looking over his spectacles, were alert but calm. His speech easy, clear, fluent, and sincere, though often drowned in the monotone. He never let harsh words cross his thin lips, but when he was indignant, his utterance was quick, weighty, and concise, as clearly to the point as a judge rendering judgment or a dagger popping out from under soft velvet cotton. He was of a light build, but his movements were steady. His artistic fingers would run deftly through the pages as he read, as if he read by paragraphs, even by pages, his quick sight grasping essential points and his retentive memory keeping knowledge in store. His love of nature and the arts made his emotions tranquil, thoughts lofty, tastes refined, manners sincere and modest, and ways of living simple and retired. His broad-mindedness was as responsive to every shade of opinion, criticism, or suggestion as a hollow in the mountains that echoes with every vibration of sound. In such a scholar, the government of Li Yuanhong, then president of the Republic, found a chancellor for the university. Under his administration, the institution underwent a radical change. Science was put on an equal footing with literature, which had reigned the realm of knowledge in China from time immemorial. History, philosophy, and the classics were studied in the light of modern scientific method. The spirit of knowledge for its own sake was encouraged. Scholars of old conservative schools, new schools, and radical schools were all given an equal chance. Old literati with queues hanging down their backs who still retained faith in a monarchical regime sat shoulder to shoulder with men of radical thought, discussing problems, joking and laughing at the same dinner table. Free inquiry into problems of knowledge, culture, family, social relations, and political systems was found in the classrooms, seminars, and social gatherings. It was the intellectual life of ancient China of the pre-Qing period, or ancient Greece of the times of Socrates and Aristotle reenacted. Dr. Tsai was the old, wise Socrates of China and would have suffered the same fate had he not had sympathizers on a nationwide scale, especially among the Kuomintang members who had a strong hold in Guangzhou. Yet, by conservative Chinese and foreigners alike, the university was accused of advocating atheism, no religion, no government, and no family, just as Socrates was accused by the ancient Greeks of corrupting the souls of young men. No argument could dispel these unfounded suspicions. History alone would disprove them, as it has absolved Socrates. I have said that Dr. Tsai advocated aesthetics as a substitute for religion, and free inquiry as a means of approach to truths. Mr. Chen Duxiu, Dean of the College of Literature, advocated science and democracy as the twin weapons to modernize China. Free inquiry led to freedom of thought. Science sapped the old beliefs. Democracy meant the assertion of popular rights. Meanwhile, Dr. Hu Shi, professor of philosophy, worked for a literary revolution by which the language in common use by the people was to replace the classical language as a medium of thought and expression. The colloquial or common written language is nearer to the Chinese spoken language and therefore easier to learn, to write, and to understand. It is a better and easier medium for the expression of thought. Its use was to popularize knowledge hitherto a monopoly of classical scholars. The movement developed a host of young writers throughout the country. After a few years, the Ministry of Education made compulsory the use of the Vulgate as a medium of instruction in all elementary schools. The university was an oasis in the intellectual desert of Peking, but the seeds of intellectual revolt grew in that small green spot with remarkable rapidity. Within 3 years, the whole institution was filled with it. In that vigorous atmosphere of intellectual activity, a mental and moral unrest developed among the students. I have related earlier how, under the influence of French 18th century political idealism with its catchwords of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and as a revolt against established authority, which the youth of the nation believed responsible for retarding China's progress and thus inviting the encroachment of foreign powers, students had gone on strike against their school authorities upon the slightest pretext. This first happened in Shanghai in 1902. The first student revolt had spent itself in the course of a few years and degenerated into strikes against the school cooks. In the end, the authorities outwitted the students by handing the management of the kitchens over to the student body. Isolated cases of strikes still persisted for some years. In one instance, this ended in tragedy when a dozen students in the provincial high school at Hangzhou died of arsenic poisoning, which the cooks put in their rice as a revenge. I went to the school after the outrage and found a large number of youths moaning in their beds, while a dozen caskets stood in the open-air gymnasium, waiting for relatives to take them for burial. While the spirit of revolt in the form of school strikes was gradually spending itself, its force turned inward into revolutionary ideas which gained much wider ground outside the schools in the form of a political revolution, resulting ultimately in the downfall of the Qing dynasty in 1911. The second student revolt burst out suddenly in Peking on May 4th, 1919, the 8th year of the Republic. What happened was this. From the peace conference in Paris, news reached China that Qingdao, in the Shandong Peninsula, a German-leased port taken from German hands during the war by the Japanese, had been awarded to Japan by the victorious powers. As China had declared war against Germany, the leased territory should, in all justice, have been returned to China. The whole nation was indignant over the news. Students in Peking, under the leadership of the National University Group, demonstrated against the signing of the Versailles Treaty. 3,000 students held mass meetings and paraded in the streets, demonstrating against acceptance of the terms, shouting, "Return Qingdao to China! Boycott Japanese goods! Down with the traitors!" Banners streamed in the air bearing the same slogans. The Peking government, despite the efforts of Dr. Sun Yat-sen's Kuomintang or Nationalist Party in Guangzhou and its adherents elsewhere, was still under the thumb of military men and ruled China with a mere semblance of the democracy and parliamentary procedure which the revolution had labored so earnestly to establish. Among its influential high officials were 3 members of a notoriously pro-Japanese group. Their sympathies were well known. These men, Cao Rulin, Minister of Communication, Lu Zongyu, Chinese Minister of Tokyo, and Zhang Zongxiang, another minister, now became the targets of student wrath. The crowd streamed to the residence of Cao, where secret meetings were supposed to have been going on. They broke in and combed the house for the 3 traitors. Cao and Lu escaped by the back door. Zhang was caught by the mob and badly beaten. Leaving him for dead, the students dispersed, in their retreat smashing everything in sight and setting the place on fire. Meanwhile, the armed police and gendarmerie had thrown a cordon around the house. They arrested some 60 students and sent them to headquarters. The rest, about 1,000 strong, followed after, each claiming individually to have been responsible for the outbreak and asking to be arrested. Finally, all were put under heavy military guard in the compounds of the Law College of the university. News concerning the demonstration was strictly censored. Some students outwitted the government, however, by sending a cable through a foreign agency in one of the foreign concessions of Tianjin. And this cable was the sole source of the news that appeared in Shanghai papers on the morning of the 5th. I was at breakfast on May 5th when the newspapers reached me. On their front pages appeared in bold letters a news item something as follows. Students in Peking demonstrated against the signing of the Versailles Treaty. 3 pro-Japanese high officials, Cao, Lu, and Zhang, were beaten by the students. The residence of Cao Rulin was burned. Several thousand have been detained under heavy armed guard in the Law College of the National University of Peking. Ringleaders were arrested, and their state is unknown. There were no further details. The whole city was excited by the news. In the afternoon, public organizations such as educational associations, chambers of commerce, and provincial and local guilds sent telegrams to the Peking government demanding the dismissal of the 3 high officials and the release of the students arrested or detained. Through the following day, all Shanghai waited anxiously for a reply from the government, but there was none. Then the students of the city went on strike, making the same demands as the public organizations, and went forth lecturing on the streets. Next morning, school boys and girls went by hundreds from door to door on Nanjing Road, the main street of Shanghai, begging the shopkeepers to go on strike. Some in sympathy and others out of fear closed their doors. Many followed suit in imitation of their neighbors. In about an hour's time, all the Nanjing Road shops were closed as tight as clams. Police interfered, but to no avail. The shop strike spread like fire. By noon, all Shanghai was shut. Thousands of people wandered about the streets, and the traffic was almost blocked. Settlement police became powerless. Boy and Girl Scouts went out as police to keep order and direct traffic. To see order maintained in the crowded streets by bobbed-haired Girl Scouts was something novel in the international settlement of Shanghai. Both Chinese and foreigners wondered why the crowd willingly obeyed the orders of young boys and girls while showing such an ugly temper toward the police. Within a few days, the student strike had grown into a nationwide movement. Shops and commercial houses closed in all the cities near Shanghai. As Shanghai was the center of commerce in the lower Yangtze Valley, these cities were paralyzed when the heart of the great metropolis ceased to beat, and suspended their affairs, not necessarily out of sympathy for the students. Settlement authorities were alarmed when employees of the waterworks and the electric company wanted to join the strike. Through the mediation of the Chamber of Commerce and student representatives, they were persuaded to stick to their jobs. The pressure continued for more than a week, and the Peking government finally gave in. The 3 pro-Japanese officials resigned, and all the students were set free. With countrywide sympathy behind them, students everywhere were intoxicated by their success. Thereafter, there was no peace for institutions of learning or for the government. The students of Peking, having won their victory, continued to agitate against corruption in the government and the old traditions which, they thought, enslaved the minds of young people. They had won over the government because they had national sentiment behind them. Everybody in China would have liked to join the demonstrations and parades against the signing of the Versailles Treaty. The students, who were better organized, more articulate, more impulsive, and less hesitant, took the lead and thus plucked at the heartstrings of the nation. When the pro-Japanese officials had resigned and the students had been released by the government, when the general strike had been called off in Shanghai and elsewhere, the incident was considered closed for the time being at least. But the university itself became a problem. Chancellor Cai Yuanpei, apparently shocked by the violence, had resigned and quietly left Peking. He went first to Tianjin, then to Shanghai, and finally slipped into Hangzhou, where he lived in a friend's house on the historic West Lake, surrounded by gentle hills, enjoying nature as a traditional scholar of the old days. Despite repeated persuasions, he declined to go back to the university. He said that he had never intended to incite the students to revolt, but that in demonstrating against acceptance of the Shandong Clause of the Versailles Treaty, they had acted on patriotic impulses which could hardly be condemned. As regarded the university, he thought that thenceforth it would be difficult to maintain discipline, as the students were likely to be intoxicated with the cup of success. Once they tasted power, there would be no end to their appetite. This was the stand he took in regard to the student movement. The belief that he was always ready to encourage a student revolt was far from the truth. Finally, he approved my going to Peking to take charge of the university for him. I consented rather reluctantly. With the heavy responsibilities thus thrust upon me, I went to Peking in July with one of the student delegates. The student body convened in a mass meeting of welcome, and this was the gist of my first speech to them. Your patriotic motives in the recent demonstrations are to be highly commended, but if you keep on doing this, your valuable time will be wasted, and the existence of the institution where you drink at the fountain of wisdom will be endangered. A new nation is not made in one day, and certainly not by demonstrations alone. The demonstrations are trifles in comparison with the work you have to do in classrooms, in the library, in laboratories, and in seminars. After the storm, the clouds began to disperse, and a clear day emerged. Dr. Cai returned to his office in September. The university was again reorganized on a sounder basis. The office of Dean of Administration was created to take charge of the business side of the university. Existing offices were modified and systematized into an organic whole. The Dean of Faculties was responsible for academic affairs. The Academic Council, members of which were elected by the professors with the deans as ex officio members, was the highest legislative body, empowered to pass on university regulations, grant degrees, and enforce discipline among the students. Various executive committees were set up to perform administrative functions. The university was put on the basis of faculty control. Academic freedom, faculty control, and a fearless spirit of searching for truth were the guiding principles in administration. Student self-government was encouraged as a step to democracy. For 7 long years, in spite of intermittent strikes and demonstrations, the university sailed along under full canvas on the rough sea of political turmoil, with men of courage and foresight at the helm. The number of volumes in the library was vastly increased, laboratory equipment much improved. Scholars of international fame, such as John Dewey and Bertrand Russell, were invited to join the university as visiting professors. The 2 Western philosophers contributed their part to the great intellectual movement in China. Dewey directed the young minds of China to the study of educational and social problems in accordance with the needs of the individual and society. It is true that the very act of thinking of problems in this way led naturally to the creation of other problems which caused trouble in such a static society as that of China in those days. Hu Hanmin, a Kuomintang leader, once told me that it was Dewey's teaching that caused unrest in the schools. But he ignored the fact that there were many student strikes under the imperial regime during pre-revolutionary days, as well as the fact that Dewey's teaching, which interested the students in social problems, thus helped the movement against the warlords later on. It is due to Russell that young minds began to get interested in principles of social reconstruction, which roused them against both religion and imperialism. To the missionaries and members of the British legation, he was an unwelcome guest. He lived in a Chinese hotel and refused to see officials of his own legation. I heard one of them express the view that his coming to China was a matter for regret. In Peking, Mr. Russell contracted a serious case of pneumonia, and at one time the doctors gave up hope. On his recovery, I heard a missionary lady say, "That's too bad." I repeated it to Mr. Russell, who laughed heartily. During those days of freedom of thought in China just after the First World War, thinking about either social problems or social principles created storms in the thinking mind and waves of emotion in the feeling heart. This prepared the way for the further introduction of Western ideas from post-war Europe. All the isms had full play in China. While the intellectuals on the whole moved along the line of Western democracy, a section of them, inspired by the success of the Russian Revolution of 1917, were attracted to the ideology of Marxism. Chen Duxiu, editor of La Jeunesse, resigning from his deanship at the University of Peking, became the leader of a Chinese communist movement. The anti-imperialist movement against Japan also prepared the ground for general sympathy among intellectuals for the Russian Revolution. In 1923, the Third International sent Mr. Yafei to Peking to make contact with Chinese intellectuals, and one evening at a dinner given in his honor at the Jieying restaurant in Peking, Dr. Cai made a speech of welcome in which he said, "The Russian Revolution has given great inspiration to the revolutionary movement in China." Russia had repeatedly announced that she was ready to give back to China the Chinese Eastern Railway in the northern part of northeast China, and wished China success in getting rid of both the warlords and the imperialistic powers that had a grip on the country. This goodwill of Soviet Russia toward China was welcomed by all the intellectuals as well as by the people as a whole. Among other things, it paved the way for the growth of communism in China. Meanwhile, eminent scientists from European and American universities came to guide students in scientific research. A number of periodicals were issued by the faculties as well as by the students. Music and art clubs, athletic associations, library and science associations sprang up in abundance. A society for the study of Marxian theories was established under the leadership of Professor Li Dazhao. The Student Army Corps, organized some time earlier to give military training to the students, was growing in size. The university gates were flung open to girls. Peking University was the first institution of higher learning in the history of education in China to accept women on an equal footing with men. Faculty and students, immersed in an atmosphere of academic freedom and free inquiry, worked in unison, happy and contented. The influence of the university was far-reaching. From every intellectual pebble thrown into the waves of ancient Peking, waves traveled to every corner of the land. Even the middle schools of the country, the equivalent of American high schools, copied its organization, introducing freedom of thought and opening their doors to girls. Progressive newspapers, magazines, and political parties echoed every movement of the university. In this atmosphere, the influence of the Kuomintang Revolution extended far and wide, while at the same time, the Communist Party began to take shape. The conflicts of the warlords, meanwhile, roared intermittently around the ancient capital. In one of these internecine wars, the gates of Peking were all closed for almost a week. Fighting was going on some 10 miles outside the city. It usually began at nightfall and lasted until dawn. Once we went to watch the artillery fire from the top of Peking Hotel. It was like watching a fire on the other side of a river. You got the entertainment of a bonfire at the expense of others without incurring the risk of being licked by the flames. A crossfire of tracers spanned the earth in the dark night like multitudes of rainbows crossing each other. The roar of cannon set the roof trembling as if in a mild earthquake. From dusk till dawn, there was no pause in the fighting. When I went home to bed, I could not turn my ears to the pillow, for the thundering of the cannon seemed much louder that way. So I lay flat in bed, with my eyes toward the ceiling, and noticed that the beautifully painted shades of the electric lights were swinging slightly. Glasses rattled. Wolfie, my German police dog, kept moaning, unable to enjoy her usual peaceful slumber on the floor. As soon as she laid her ear to the floor, she would start, get up, groan, dart for the door, and scratch it violently, thinking that these abominable sounds came from beneath the floor of my bedroom. The next morning, I scolded her for being naughty the previous night. She stared at me with guilty eyes. From the breakfast table, I called to her, but she did not respond. I never saw her again. Presumably, she wandered away in search of a land of peace where no mocking devils would pound the ground at night and she could sleep well. But I am afraid she was sorely disappointed. On one of those days in the besieged city, I took a walk with a friend along Shuncheng Main Street. People went about their business as usual, without a trace of excitement. As usual, people were pulling or being pulled in rickshaws. We turned at Xidan Pailo into Xichang'anjie and then into Central Park. The yellow enamel tiles of the imposing towers on the Wu Gate of the palace glittered in the slanting autumn sun against the cloudless blue. We chose a spot under the spreading branches of one of the ancient spruces planted there in rows and squares by early Qing emperors centuries ago. The air was laden with their fragrance, and light winds brushed our faces with the soothing odor. We sat at a table listening to the gossip at neighboring tables. People all talked about the war and wondered which side was going to win and who was going to have Peking as a spoil of war. All seemed to be utterly unconcerned. What is the use of worrying? Peking had seen many wars and vicissitudes of fortune, but remained the same, as the towers of the Wu Gate bore silent witness. Let's order a fish for dinner and see whether we get it, with the city gates all closed, said my friend. A waiter came with the fish wriggling in his hand. How would you like to have it? 2 ways. Split it in half, one half fried with sweet and sour gravy spread on top, the other half cooked with bean sauce. The fish came. One of the 2 halves tasted stale. Why? One half of the fish was from a dead one, said my friend to the waiter, who bowed and smiled. Oh, I see. The fish sailed in over the city wall. The side that hit the ground was dead, while the other was still alive, I said. When the waiter came back again, my friend snatched one of the empty wine jars on the table and showed it to him. What? You have given us an empty jar. Sorry, the waiter was smiling. The liquor has evaporated. He immediately brought us a new one. Of course, both were charged to our account. We went back home at dusk. That night, the fighting ceased. I thought of Wolfie. She must have slept in peace somewhere in the city. The next morning, we found the government had changed hands. The palace remained the same. The people went about as usual. The city was undisturbed. The gates were flung open, and thousands of people from the country streamed in with vegetables, meat, eggs, and fish. Donkeys, mules, and camels followed in the wake of the pedestrians. Children gathered empty cannon shells and shrapnel from the battleground and sold them in the streets for a few dollars. Out of these shells, we made flower vases. Many people outside the city lost their property. A number of them lost their lives. I lost my Wolfie. On the whole, the losses to property and life in the various war areas during those long, distressing years were negligible. It was the unsettled state of mind, the disruption of communications, the ruined finances, the disturbances of order and upset of administrative machinery of the government, above all, the obstruction of the tranquil flow of blood in the veins of national life that reduced China to such a paralyzed state that she became an easy prey to the aggressor neighbor. The division of the country made any nationwide constructive plan for the country well nigh impossible. Unification was what China needed. I acted for the second time for Chancellor Cai when he went for a visit to Europe. At this time, a letter from Dr. Sun Yat-sen lauded the movements in the university and ended in the following words: "Lead the 3,000 disciples to help the cause of revolution." Dr. Sun did not live to see his hopes come true, but only a few years later, his successor, General Chiang Kai-shek, led the nationalist army sweeping down from Guangzhou to the Yangtze Valley, then to the Yellow River Valley, and finally to Peking, treading the path psychologically prepared for the new nationalist victory by the revolutionary movements, which had started in Peking and permeated the minds of all classes of people in the country.
What you just heard is Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-min, and published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. Some names and terminologies in this book have been updated per contemporary usages.